problem is angels can fall. Angels are on their own arc of development with their own tasks, and they have to develop a kind of discernment and a kind of evolution within their own scheme, within their own development. I have a question about the passage in the Bible, Genesis 6, 1 to 4. And it is that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and that they took them as wives of all which they chose. Who were the sons of God and who were the daughters of man? This is probably the portion in Genesis that gets everybody up in arms, because it's really showing this impossible interface between angels and humans. And in our time, in the post-Atlantean period, we don't see angels walking around, not unless you have spent, time and you're incredibly clairvoyant and you're an ascetic and you see angels all the time and you see spiritual beings all the time. Most people do not see the angels around them all the time. We're not thinking about how to interact with an angel or what those laws are. Our current time, we think about that probably the least we ever have, in the sense of being able to actually comprehend it. We're very far from that right now. So what is being described in Genesis is something that has happened at many different times in human development, which is that fallen angels will influence humanity through reproduction. This is not something unusual. This happened in Lemuria. This happened in Atlantis. This has happened many different times. It's happening right now. Okay, so what happens is you have a fallen angel. So a son of God is another word for angel. Okay, men are in the natural world. So when you look at the cosmos and you look at the spiritual hierarchies, you're looking at different kinds of beings, different classes of beings that propagate their own realm, okay, that are in their own realm. So the natural world is man's realm. And that's called men. Men are the natural world. That's the physical world. That's the earth. Above that is the supernatural world. And within that are the 9 hierarchies of angels in classes of 3. So there's all of these different spiritual hierarchies. I usually have an image that I pull up here. So all those angels that you see, from seraphim to angel, those are really like the sons of God. Okay, they're angels. A man is in the natural world, and sons of God are godly beings that are in the spiritual world. The problem is angels can fall. Angels are on their own arc of development with their own tasks, and they have to develop a kind of discernment and a kind of evolution within their own scheme, within their own development that's similar in some ways to ours, different but related. And so, my interpretation of that is the sons of God are referring to angels. There's different classes of angels. Angels can be fallen, angels can be whole. But what they're talking about here is fallen angels that are breaking their oath, and they're not supposed to directly interact with humanity in this way. There are certain laws around spiritual connection with humans, and it is always in a leadership position, in a sacrifice position. Angels are not supposed to become selfish. They're not supposed to take. They're not supposed to be in that fallen position in which there are hordes of them that fall, right? So fallen angels began to enter into, sort of interfere with human reproduction, is what you could say, in an attempt to see and know themselves. So this again happened, not just like Genesis 6 is describing something that's happened many different times. Even some of the weird sex rites that you see that are like calling in these dark entities to be part of sexual union. There are some dark occult rites where you would literally call in a fallen angel to be part of your sexual union. And you ask for a fallen angel to enter into your sexual partner. Okay. Now, today, if a fallen angel enters into a sexual union with a woman, right, through a man, there's a kind of protection that we have today where it's not going to produce a giant. It's not going to produce this deformed thing. But in earlier times, it was much more plastic. In earlier times, the human being was much more subject to its spiritual influences. And that's where you get this kind of Lord of the Rings, like different kinds of people and all this sort of stuff, because the human form was much more plastic to what it was being spiritually exposed to. Now it is not that way. The human form is completely solid. It cannot be changed in the way that it was in the Lemurian period and even the Atlantean period. So in that time, if you did that act, which people still try to do today by calling in demonic entities when they're having sex, this is part of black magic. But if you did it in the earlier time, you would actually produce a really messed up offspring. It was forbidden. But again, it always comes down to understanding the conditions of these earlier parts of the earth. We don't understand the conditions and what was possible during the earlier parts of the earth. We don't understand the Bible. The Bible is not talking about, in Genesis 6, is not talking about a condition on earth now. It is talking about a condition much earlier, that it was possible to create garish, horrific offspring if an angel entered into sexual union between a man and a woman. In earlier periods, there didn't even need to be a man there. It was just women could become completely impregnated by horrible things. It was like a dark immaculate conception that could happen. And in a lot of ways, having sexual union as we do now protected from that, which is the story in partially of like is it like Sophia gives birth to all these dark things? So in a lot of ways, the interaction where men and women began to create protected in a lot of ways women from that. So, and then even early, I'm not going to get into reproduction. We do not have time to get into reproduction through the 7 epochs, but that's that. And a lot of people have trouble with it for the simple reason that reproduction changes with every epoch. There's different aspects to it that come forward, which is why even a lot of things about the Eastern system and the sexual parts of Tantra, they don't even apply to us now, because all of these things are shifting. And the only way we're going to understand this stuff is we have to understand spiritual science and how human beings operated in the earlier epochs in form. What was the form like? How did the form relate to the spiritual world? How did reproduction happen? Okay. And the earth itself. How solid was the earth? How open was the earth to the spiritual hierarchies? These are questions that completely shape and our ability to understand Genesis, our ability to understand, talk about angels. How does remote viewing work? Can people watch you without your consent if they have the ability? This feels like an infringement on free will to me, and it only makes sense to me that people with a background in the dark occult could do something like that. Is it possible to accidentally remote view someone without their consent as a psychic? Remote viewing is very popular today. You see people on YouTube and podcasts that claim to be remote viewing things. They're a remote viewer. And really, remote viewing is a military process. So what we understand as remote viewing is a methodical series of psychic preparations and technique that was developed by the military. So when people talk about remote viewing, it's not really like a initiation term. It's not really something like when you go and you would take part in a temple culture or like a mystery school, they're not going to teach you like remote viewing, right? Remote viewing is sort of like the lowest form of spiritual activity because you're just basically going off in your astral body and looking at a target. Like, in what form of actual spiritual life, meaning you're developing yourself or you're serving humanity or whatever, at when do we do that? It's a misuse of psychic ability. And it's interesting. I think it can be validated. I think that, Joe McMonagle, who remote viewed Mars, and the other really famous remote viewer who passed recently, Ingo Swann. There's all kinds of people who are remote viewers, but it's not the highest spiritual activity. It's basically just psychic spying, right? And when you're really doing psychic work, when you're really using your spiritual abilities, they should be in service to humanity, and in service to something higher. Otherwise, you're sort of putting yourself in spiritual danger, right? You shouldn't be using your spiritual abilities to serve the military, to spy on someone. It's this harmonic breaking down of spiritual processes into like a mechanical thing that's completely disconnected from its real life-giving purpose and meaning. And so, and also like, when you're remote viewing something, you're not going to like remote view outside of your capacity. So there's certain parts of the spiritual world that you cannot enter unless you're an initiate, which means you have to be dedicated to a moral life for a certain period of time, to the point that your spiritual bodies are catalyzed in a certain way that you can pass through certain channels in the spiritual world, certain gates in the spiritual world. You have to be able to sustain sometimes incredible spiritual energy. And the only way you can sustain and hold really high spiritual energy is you have to be moral, and you have to have a certain level of regained innocence, which is the mystery of the Pleiades. So there's certain things that you're just not going to see. You're not going to get information on certain people, on certain things, because you're not an initiate, and an initiate would never do that to begin with. They would never spy on someone for someone else or for themselves, because when you're actually a powerful spiritual individual, that is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's childish to do something like that. It's silly. In fact, how people became very powerful initiates and bore some of the most incredible powers was actually through never using them for themselves at all, ever. And every single time they could have developed a city like that, a power like that, they renounced it and dedicated it back to God and said, you use this capacity. I will not use it for myself. And they became more and more and more powerful. So the greatest initiates in the world got that way through actually renouncing every spiritual power they had back to God, which made it more powerful, which made them greater initiates, which made them capable of withstanding more spiritual power, which would crush them before. So the great initiates never actually really used their spiritual abilities selfishly, really at all, unless it was a mistake and they overcame it. This is where we are, guys. We're at a point where we're being told this stuff is cool, it's fine, take a class. No, that is not initiation. There are certain standards that we have to uphold to evolve. And yes, I am the spirituality police today. I have a badge. I have a car. I am the spirituality police. I'm the initiation police. And I'm arresting all emote viewers right after this session. No, but we have to have standards. You know, we have to, it has to produce evolution. It has to produce life. If we're going to do spiritual things, it must produce life. That's the standard. Okay. So no, people who are remote viewers, like, it is a miraculous ability, but no, they can't view you when you're in the bathroom or having a shower. They don't just get free reign over you because you're a psychic. They just can't view any piece of information that they want. They will get impressions and they may see things, but it's very fragmented. And they cannot force themselves into people's lives. They have certain limits, and that limit is controlled by your angel. It's negotiated by the angels involved between the people. Like, there's a certain, I have to also say, there's a certain amount of information that is going to be in your aura. There's certain things about you, certain archetypes that you embody, certain things about your life, certain things about you are going to be in your aura. People who are psychic will be able to pick that up to a certain degree, in which mainly they have knowledge of that quality within themselves. So they'll recognize it. All psychic ability is partly recognition, right? Remembrance. So there is a part of you that people can tune into, but they do not have some sort of like look into your soul objectively, whatever they want to know, whenever they want to look. No, that's not, they can't do that. And thank God, because that would be weird and intrusive. Dude, what do the dark occultists fear most? What is the linchpin they want to hide that undoes all their work over the centuries? Well, the dark occultists fear, I would say, a couple things. The first thing they fear the most is Christ and the right understanding and relation to Christ. The second thing they fear is people figuring out that they're completely automatic and depend completely on certain symbols, times, and dates. These are the two things that keep coming back again and again when I think about, you know, what dark occultists' weak spots are. So you always get these like weird interpretations of like Christ. Like Christ is always defined in some weird way that does not lead the individual to their own advancement. And I think that that's always pretty much a dark entity working there. I think that the dark side understands that if people come to understand Christ, not the weird and kind of mixed up dogmatic versions of Christianity. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about the kind of weird dogmatic stuff that objectively does not represent Christ. That's human earth stuff. That's a dead stream. I'm talking about really understanding Christ, really understanding the mechanics of Christ and the human being, and that's how the human being becomes immortal, and understanding the right and the sacrifice that Christ did to give us that capacity. That is something that dark entities do not want, because when you develop your immortal body, they cannot touch you, they cannot feed on you, they cannot enter into your life at all. So dark entities want to make it so you don't understand God. And to do that, they have to make it so you don't have the right conception of Christ to enter into a relationship with him properly. Now, Christ is hard enough to understand on a good day without demonic entities in mind. It's a completely advanced and transcendental concept, and a lot of people misunderstand it just because it's hard. But there are demonic elements to that are absolutely there too. And this is where you see these weird slogans about like Jesus is just a symbol, God, Christ is just like it's just an archetype, or Jesus had all these kids, or there's all these weird things that become massive narratives, partly because they're a recreation of prior conditions of humanity and trying to force the new condition into the old condition, right? But then there's also elements where we know that fallen angels work through trying to enforce what is no longer relevant and trying to force those conditions onto present. Evil is something out of time. Fallen angels work by trying to bring about the old conditions, trying to force humanity, which is beyond the moon, beyond the lunar condition, beyond these sort of earlier stages, force humanity backwards into their earlier stage where they feel like they have control. So they always want to they always want to regress humanity into a prior condition, into these prior old beliefs or whatever. They usually work in those. They can never be prescient. They can never be on time. They can never really understand Christ, and they don't want you to either. So the number one thing they do is they want to confuse our understanding of Jesus, our understanding of Christ, which works pretty well. I've seen people have an aversion to just talking about Jesus. Like, you can talk about Buddha all day long, okay? You can talk about Krishna. People are like, oh, interesting. Buddha did what? They're so interested, right? But the moment it's Jesus, people are like, oh, like, no, no Jesus. We can't talk about Jesus. There's a weird thing where that is a figure, a historical figure, and a powerful man who bore the Christ, that for some reason, like, it's embarrassing to talk about, or it's cringy to talk about Jesus. Like, why is that? And a part of it is the weird dogmatic stuff, but there's also something deeper, and that's because of the power that is in that. The other thing that the dark side does not want you to know is that the dark side is limited, and they can't create in the moment. They can't be creative, right? The dark side can't produce life because, again, they can't unite with Christ, so they can't produce life. That's how you create the life body, the eternal body, is it's a process of transmutation. They can only create death, and that's what they create in the body when you attune to it. And so they can't actually be creative. Like, they can't look out into the cosmos or into humanity and actually figure out what is needed or what is true through a calculation that they can do. You can only do that through God's help. You can only see truth through God. You can only figure out and distill certain truths through entering into God, right? So when you don't do that, because you're demonic, you can only use what is past, what has already been. You can only use the obvious. You can only use the symbols that exist, the rituals that exist, and you can only use the old pre-Christian methods, or try to distort the real stuff. They can try that. But even when they distort it, they just create this like old image of the world. And that's why the Bible says you will know them by their symbols. Because the dark occult is limited to only using certain symbols, only using certain times. And actually, their whole thing, their whole existence is from already established stuff. There's no genius in it. There's no creation. There's no real on the fly being able to connect with God. It has to be through these methodical times, dates, places, symbols, machines. Automatic. It has to be automatic. It has to be technology. It has to be certain times. It has to be certain dates. They cannot operate outside of that. Now, when you become a spiritual individual united with Christ, you're not limited to times, to dates, to certain rituals, to certain symbols. It's all happening within. The kingdom of heaven is within. You can create what you want, when you want, within yourself. You can know things. You can have a spiritual life that's all within you. You don't have to do anything externally for it. Back in the day, in the pre-Christ condition, that wasn't the case. If you wanted to know something, you had to wait until a certain lunar phase and a certain season to connect with that particular angel and offer them this particular flower. And then you'd have to wait a period of time to get that information back. You couldn't just know through an inner process. You had to actually participate in nature and participate in the hierarchies to then maybe be given something at a certain time when it would come through. So you were part of this sort of machine of the cosmos. You weren't an individual. That's how early paganism was. And as there's an entire process of getting information, of getting something, of connecting with something, you had to wait for it. It had to come through. It had to come down. You had to give this and that, and then it would maybe that's how it was. We don't live in that time anymore. We live in a time where it's all happening within you, and you can still be part of those rhythms. You can still use them. They're still meaningful. We're still there, but they don't determine our ability to heal, our ability to get information, our ability to communicate with our angel, our ability to do any of that. It is not limited by that anymore. And that is why we have to understand Christ, is because it's a totally different way of operation. Totally different. I'm going to talk about this more actually in my spirit guide class that I have coming in February. The different systems between a demonic communication and your angel. It's a totally different set of situations going on. So, to conclude, the demonic system has to use what we would consider like the older cycles of nature. They have to use certain entities. They have to feed certain entities. They're limited completely in what they're doing to using certain symbols, to working with certain fallen angels that even then can only really be as powerful as humanity gives them power. Christ does not get his power from humanity. Angels do not get their power from human beings. They give life to human beings so that we may become like them. Actually, they sacrifice for human beings. Demonic entities are only as powerful as humanity is unawake. There's many differences there, right? So they have to use certain times and dates. So when you're looking at the dark occult, they have to do certain things at certain times. When people start to really understand occultism, they'll start to see, oh, when you look at the calendar and you understand the cosmos, oh, they have to do that. They have to do certain, well, that really rains on their parade when you start to become educated in occult science and you realize that, oh, this is the time that they're going to do that. Oh, well, that's what that symbol means. Gosh, it puts themselves out of business, right? When you start to actually understand that they're limited to these times and dates and symbols. They're limited to certain activities based on forces that they can't even control, based on whether they can manipulate people or not. It's a completely inferior and pathetic form of magic that's getting weaker and weaker through their own greed. Because of their own greed, they're exposing themselves. But that's what I would place there. They're really two different systems, and the demonic system totally limited and obvious, and will become more and more obvious as people awaken to, especially the technology thing too. Like the dark occult has to use technology because they will never ever surrender their ego to Christ and become immortal naturally. So the dark occult will always seek to use technology as its excuse for spirituality. It's just natural. They will externalize and materialize it as much as they can, because in becoming internal and spiritualizing is Christ. So externalizing and materializing is Antichrist. It is Surat Ahriman. So yeah, they're also going to inevitably be known from their major symbol, which is technology, which they don't use as a tool. They think it's a deity. They think it's an entity. Like, normal people see technology as just a tool, but they're like thinking that like it's gonna give them power, and like God is in the machine, and like we're gonna incarnate like entities into the field that we create. Like, they just can't use it as a tool. It has to be this weird spiritual thing. So that's also